A tourist crossed the forbidden line, believing his money gave him the right to do anything. With a beer bottle in hand, he brazenly reached for the bearskin hat of a royal guard, mocking the guard's silence. The crowd froze, expecting the guardsman to remain motionless as always. But his reaction was so unexpected that it instantly changed the course of events and made everyone see the situation in a completely different light. How did this day end? Let's start from the very beginning. The morning in London was surprisingly sunny. Crowds of tourists were flocking to Buckingham Palace, buzzing like a swarm of excited bees. Smartphones flashed. Cameras clicked every few seconds. People chattered away, trying to find the perfect angle for a photo with the royal guards, a symbol of British tradition and discipline. Among the guards on duty stood Harry Fleming. His scarlet tunic was pressed to perfection, and his bearskin hat sat squarely on his head. His calm gaze and impeccably straight posture created the image of a man for whom duty was paramount. Harry wasn't just doing his job, he was part of a legacy, upholding tradition with the same precision with which he held his rifle. The crowd occasionally amused themselves by trying to make him laugh, but he knew. Stoicism was a language that spoke for itself. As always, among the curious tourists, there was bound to be someone trying to stand out. And there he was, the antagonist of the day, Mark, a man with a smirk and the demeanor of a tourist who clearly believed the world revolved around him. With his worn-out cap, a wrinkled t-shirt that read YOLO, and jeans that had apparently endured far more than he had, Mark stood out like a sore thumb. His constant companion was a beer bottle, which he clutched as if his life depended on it. "Well, Mr. Big Ben, you still alive over there?" he shouted loudly, drawing everyone's attention. The crowd fell silent at first, then chuckled. Someone pulled out their phone, sensing that a spectacle was about to unfold. Emboldened by the reaction, Mark took a couple of unsteady steps closer to the invisible line that any sensible person knew was not to be crossed. But common sense, it seemed, had been left out of Mark's vacation luggage. "Come on, at least blink an eye, you red statue," he continued, waving his beer bottle around dramatically. Harry remained motionless. His gaze stayed fixed somewhere in the distance, as if he hadn't heard a word. But he had. He heard every word. His muscles tensed but did not flinch. Harry knew that men like Mark came and went. Their provocations meant nothing if you held on to your dignity. The crowd began to murmur. Some stifled laughter. Someone whispered, "This guy's definitely drunk. He's going to regret this." Another muttered with clear annoyance, "Seriously? Why do people do this? Guardsmen aren't clowns." But Mark was undeterred. His voice grew louder, his gestures more exaggerated. He seemed to feed off the attention of the onlookers like some sort of energy vampire. "I'm a tourist," he shouted, as if that justified his behavior. "I pay money. I deserve a show." Some people started recording videos. The murmurs grew into soft exclamations. Anticipation hung in the air. What would happen next? The crowd's mood shifted. Some watched with disapproval, while others chuckled quietly, entertained by the absurdity of the situation. But someone, with a serious tone, remarked, "I hope he doesn't do anything really stupid." Mark, however, was convinced that creating a scene was his right. After all, he paid money. In his mind, the guards were nothing more than performers, no different from those in budget theme parks. This conviction emboldened him, though it also made him look ridiculous to those watching. Harry knew he had to hold his ground. All he could do now was be who he had always been, a symbol of honor and discipline, refusing to let emotions take over. But inside he felt anger quietly simmering. Mark raised his beer bottle higher, as if preparing to make a toast. "Come on, mate, for the Queen! At least crack a smile, huh?" The crowd gasped. Several people began whispering indignantly, "That's going too far." But Harry remained still as a statue. Mark laughed, thinking he was winning. Only a trained eye might have noticed the faintest tension in the guard's facial muscles. For Harry, it was just another day of duty, but for Mark, it was a day he would never forget. Mark stood in front of Harry, basking in the attention of the crowd, which had already begun raising their phones to capture the show. For Mark, this was his moment to shine, or so he thought, and he clearly wasn't planning to stop anytime soon. "Hey, since you don't feel like talking," he began, stepping forward, "I'll help you lighten up a bit." Before anyone could fully grasp his intentions, Mark reached for Harry's bearskin hat. Time seemed to freeze in that instant. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Hey, don't touch him!" But Mark just smirked, as if caught in a harmless prank at a kindergarten. "Relax," he exclaimed, taking a loud swig from his beer bottle. "I'm just helping the poor guy out. Look at him, he can't even move." At this point, part of the crowd started showing visible irritation. A young woman with a child nearby said loudly, "This is disgusting. Where's security?" But Mark wasn't fazed. He took another step forward, crossing the white line that separated the guardsmen from the crowd. A line no self-respecting tourist would ever dare to breach. Now, Mark was standing almost toe-to-toe with Harry, clearly trying to provoke him. His actions grew bolder and more aggressive. He reached out and pretended to grab the guard's hat. For a moment, he froze, as if expecting Harry to finally react. But Harry remained motionless, as still as a statue. "Oh, silly me," Mark said, dramatically pulling his hand back. "I forgot. I'm not part of your royal robot club." The crowd buzzed with mixed emotions. Whispers of disapproval blended with murmurs of frustration. Some people kept recording on their phones, while others shook their heads in disbelief. "This is disgraceful," an older woman with an umbrella said loudly. "How can someone mock such traditions?" But Mark didn't seem to hear her. He waved his beer bottle around, grinning and glancing back at the audience. "See, he's not going to do anything. I've won," he declared, throwing his arms up as if he'd just won a world championship. Harry, as before, maintained his unshakable composure, but if someone had looked closely into his eyes, they might have noticed the faintest narrowing. It was an almost imperceptible response, invisible to most, but it hinted that Harry's patience was wearing thin. "This is absolutely unacceptable," muttered an elderly man standing beside the woman with the umbrella. "These guards represent our heritage. How can anyone be so shameless?" Meanwhile, Mark continued his performance, clearly feeling like the king of the moment. He turned to the crowd, raised his beer bottle as if making a toast, and loudly proclaimed, "To the Queen," or, how do you say it? "God save the King?" Someone in the crowd chuckled nervously, but it was more out of discomfort than support. Most of the onlookers disapproved of what was happening, yet no one stepped in. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Mark, however, seemed ready to take things even further. Staggering slightly, he began swinging his beer bottle around like a sword, adding even more absurdity to his antics. "I'm a guardsman," he shouted, attempting to mimic Harry's rigid posture but nearly tripping over his own feet. "Oh, looks like the uniform doesn't suit me as well." Harry remained standing, motionless and focused. Inside, he felt the tension building, but his duty was clear. Hold firm until the situation was truly out of control. But something told everyone present that the climax of this encounter would be unforgettable. Mark, now fully immersed in his self-proclaimed stardom, continued his antics. His grin widened, like that of a child who had found a new toy. The crowd, however, was no longer laughing. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Someone whispered, "Does he really think he can get away with this?" And then it happened, the moment no one expected. Harry took a step forward. His impeccably polished boots glided across the stone pavement, producing a barely audible sound. But to Mark, that single movement was as deafening as a thunderclap. "You've crossed the line. Step back," Harry commanded. His voice was deep like a tiger's growl, yet as clear and sharp as a ringing bell. For a moment, Mark froze. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that the guardsman could not only move, but also speak. Yet instead of retreating like any sensible person might, Mark decided to double down. "Wow, he's alive," Mark shouted, turning to the crowd. "All right, folks, let's really get this show started." Mark raised his beer bottle, pretending to pour its contents over Harry. The gesture was exaggerated and theatrical, but to the onlookers it was a blatant act of disrespect. The crowd gasped. The woman with the umbrella shouted, "This is too much!" But Harry was faster. His reaction was as swift as a cobra's strike. He took another step forward, raised his hand, and knocked the bottle away before it could come anywhere near his pristine uniform. The bottle shattered against the stone, sending shards and beer splashing onto the ground. Mark stumbled backward, momentarily losing his balance, though he managed to steady himself before falling. His face changed instantly, from smug and cocky to shocked and confused. The crowd erupted. Some people clapped, others cheered. "Serves him right." Remaining composed and resolute, Harry spoke as if delivering an order from a royal throne. "You will leave this area." His tone was calm, but carried an authority that silenced even the most boisterous tourists. At that moment, police officers who had been observing the situation from a distance approached the scene. One of them placed a firm but calm hand on Mark's shoulder. "Time to go, mate," the officer said, clearly not in the mood for any arguments. Mark, of course, tried to defend himself. "It was just a show. Don't you people understand humor?" But the officers weren't listening. They escorted him off the square with little fanfare, leaving behind the murmurs of the crowd and the flashes of dozens of recording phones. "What a disgrace," muttered an elderly man. "People like him shouldn't even be allowed here." The woman with a child shook her head in agreement. How can someone be so disrespectful? As the crowd began to disperse, the atmosphere remained charged for a while longer. Meanwhile, Harry returned to his post as if nothing had happened. He adjusted his bearskin hat, raised his rifle, and resumed his stoic stance, motionless as a statue. But for everyone who had witnessed the scene, Harry was no longer just a figure in a uniform. He had become the embodiment of discipline, honor, and unshakable calm, a living symbol of the tradition Mark had so brazenly tried to undermine. As the police led Mark away, the square in front of Buckingham Palace was engulfed in a brief silence. It wasn't the kind of silence born of boredom, but the stillness that follows an explosion as everyone processes what just happened. The crowd stood quietly, as if reflecting on the scene they had just witnessed, and then burst into applause. "Bravo!" shouted one of the tourists. "Serves him right." Cameras were still capturing the moment. People whispered to one another, "That was incredible. That guardsman is a living legend. I hope they ban that idiot from ever entering the country again." Harry, seemingly oblivious to the commotion around him, adjusted his bearskin hat, pivoted slightly on his heel, and resumed his usual position. His face was as impassive as ever, yet his posture conveyed a subtle sense of pride, not for himself, but for the tradition he represented, which had once again withstood the assault of arrogance and foolishness. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations still animated by what they had seen. "He's a true example of honor and dignity," remarked the elderly woman with the umbrella, nodding to her companion. "Indeed, and that hooligan. What on earth was he thinking?" replied the man as he removed his glasses. Meanwhile, the internet was just starting to buzz. The first videos of the incident had already appeared on social media platforms, capturing Mark's failed attempts to provoke Harry and Harry's dignified, disciplined response. Headlines accompanied the videos. "Guardsman versus tourist, a battle of honor. Disrespectful tourist humiliates himself trying to shame the royal guard." Comments began flooding in. "That tourist got exactly what he deserved. Respect traditions, especially when it's the royal guard. The guardsman is the epitome of resilience. Incredible how he kept his composure." Some added witty remarks. Who knew a bearskin hat could be such a shield against stupidity? Mark wanted a show. Well, he got one, just not the kind he planned. The videos spread across the globe, amassing millions of views and likes. The story quickly became a viral meme. What happens when you try to disrespect British tradition? As for Harry, he remained true to his role. To him, this was just another day on duty. Despite the drama that had unfolded, he viewed his work as something much greater than himself. The uniform, the stance, the silence. It wasn't just a job, but a service to something larger than any individual. While the world discussed Mark's disgrace and laughed at his misstep, Harry stood tall, as calm and majestic as ever. For the onlookers, he had become a symbol of how honor, discipline, and tradition could triumph over modern arrogance. And somewhere in the dispersing crowd, someone quietly whispered, "This is why I love Britain."